Welcome back to Higher Change. The title of the chapter today is Perfectly Abnormal. We're going to talk about abnormal behavior and psychopathology. So the point of this lesson today is that all of us have some psychological struggles. All of us have emotional wounds that need healing in some form. And it's often due to psychological trauma or stress that either we've experienced personally or we've indirectly received from other people. So in this lesson, you'll define psychopathology, you'll list criteria for abnormal behavior or a disorder, you'll describe different theoretical models for the cause of abnormal behavior, you'll discuss the pros and cons of diagnostic labels, we'll describe the basic general criteria for major categories of disorders, and we'll discuss general theories about the role of traumatic stress. First off, what is abnormality? The study of abnormal behavior is known as psychopathology. It's not about studying psychopaths, it's simply the pathology of the mind. So pathology is studying disease or illness, so this is about mental illness, literally. So first of all, let's define what is a disorder. A disorder, first of all, must be statistically rare or else it's normal. Disorders are by definition something that is not normal. Then in addition to that, it deviates from social norms, which is essentially the same thing, just looking at it from a qualitative perspective, not necessarily a numerical perspective, but it's basically outside of social norms. So for example, if somebody is doing strange things that is not normal for what other people would do, then that would probably be an indicator. Now, that by itself is not necessarily doesn't necessarily mean it's a disorder. It needs other criteria, but it's a sign that it could be. It must also cause subjective discomfort. So if they deviate from social norms, but they're okay with it and everybody else is okay with it, that's not a disorder. A disorder must cause a person discomfort. It's something that they're not comfortable with, that it's causing them problems. It must, in addition, going along with that, it must interfere with daily functioning. So if it's a thing that happens once in a while, but it's not a big deal, that's not really a disorder. It might be a feature of their personality, but it's not a disorder. Disorder requires that it's interfering to a degree where it's impairing someone's functionality, their functioning. In addition, a disorder is maladaptive. That basically means that it's a poor form of coping or adjustment. If you break that word down, mal simply means bad, and so it's a bad adaptation to change. So it's a poor form of a coping or adjustment. And that also means that this person is typically, they could also be a danger to themselves or a danger to others. That's not necessarily a requirement to be a disorder, but that's an example of being maladaptive. So abnormality is distinct from insanity, which is a legal term. So if you recall, we've talked about lunatic asylums or insane asylums. Those were places that people got sent to when they were deemed by society as insane. For example, if they pled in a courtroom that they were not guilty by reason of insanity, then they might be sent to an asylum. But those are legal definitions. Those are not psychological terms. So I hope you understand that that is a word you would see in a courtroom, but it's not a word that would be used by psychologists. So let's just review some spiritualistic or metaphysical perspectives. As we've talked about in a previous chapter, this is just a summary or recap before we dive into the modern view of abnormal behavior. So as you recall, there have been changing concepts of abnormal behavior that can be traced to at least as early as 3000 BC from evidence of trepanning, or drilling holes in the skull of an ill person's head to let out evil spirits. As you recall, the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates, the father of medicine, believed that behavior was controlled by four humors: And those humors were blood, yellow bile, phlegm or water, and black bile. And he believed that the balance of these contributed to their personality, or imbalance would contribute to illness. And in the Bible, Jesus cast out demons from people who may have had mental illnesses, or they might have had epilepsy. But either way, this was known as exorcism. He practiced exorcism for those things that people didn't quite understand. In the Middle Ages, it was common to believe that the mentally ill were possessed by evil spirits or demons, which were cast out through exorcism. So this is just an extension of what Christ did and early Christians practiced. So they believed that they would try to cast out evil spirits. Now, the unfortunate thing is that they failed to differentiate between what might be a physical cause versus a spiritual cause or a mental cause. As we've seen in previous chapters before, the Bible seems to differentiate between the two. So, but unfortunately, we are untrained people who do not understand medicine may not be able to see or understand the difference. During the Renaissance, belief in demon possession was replaced by a belief in witchcraft. So due to the fear of witches, mentally ill people were most likely called witches and put to death. And unfortunately, women were oftentimes the victims. There was a fear of women gaining freedom. There was taboo about women's sexuality. And so a lot of that played a role. And so that's why, unfortunately, women were oftentimes labeled as witches. Mental asylums were a booming business in the United States and Britain in the 1800s, as they were mostly privately run. And unfortunately, that led to a lot of abuses, which led to their reform and deinstitutionalization. But media and Hollywood still likes to portray asylums in movies. And so I'm going to show you a clip from one movie that just illustrates how asylums have been portrayed.
To get out. I'm gonna escape from here. There's armed guards everywhere.
Let's look at some common models of explaining abnormal behavior. As we've discussed already, abnormal behavior or disorders must be statistically rare. They must deviate from social norms, cause subjective discomfort, and interfere with daily functioning and considered maladaptive in order to be classified as a disorder. But let's look at some theories that explain why people do these things. The first theory is the biological model. The biological model of psychopathology proposes that medical issues are what cause psychological disorders. Mental illnesses are seen as caused by chemical or structural malfunctions in the nervous system. And so that is a very important model because there's a lot of truth to that. But it's not necessarily the only model because it doesn't necessarily explain thought processes, or at least we don't understand the connection between our thoughts and the biology. So that requires other models. The oldest one, or the more traditional one, is the psychodynamic model, and that was introduced by Freud. In the psychodynamic model, abnormal behavior stems from repressed conflicts in the unconscious mind. So that's why the iceberg is used as a symbol for this, because Freud talked about how the unconscious mind was like below the surface, and so we only know the tip of the iceberg, which is the conscious mind. And the unconscious mind is driven a lot by our past experiences. In the behaviorism model, abnormal behavior is behavior that is learned through conditioning or reinforcement. So the dog is used as a symbol for this because if you recall Ivan Pavlov's dog experiment, in his experiments, the dog was conditioned to salivate at the sound of a bell. And so this is an example of how behavior is conditioned or reinforced by the environment. And so abnormal behavior then is seen as caused by reinforcement or conditioning from the environment. The fourth model is the cognitive model. And in cognitive psychologists propose this model, which says that abnormal behavior comes from irrational beliefs and illogical or faulty thinking patterns. So they're going to be interested in the conscious thoughts, and they're going to be interested in what kind, how logical it is, and that sort of thing. So the fifth model is the sociocultural model. And in this model, norms and customs should be considered when diagnosing behavior. And that's because they see behavior as a product of the family, society, and culture. And so, something that might be abnormal in one culture may not be, or it may be normal in one culture, but abnormal in another. So we have to consider the context before we diagnose. And lastly, the biopsychosocial model sees abnormal behavior as due to the interaction of biological, psychological, social, and cultural influences. So it integrates all of these approaches. So let's revisit the sociocultural perspective. That can be broken down into social and cultural. And so in the social perspective, behavior is in the context of the family, the social group, and the larger culture. So we want to look at how does a family play a role, for example. And then we look at the culture. That means that we need to consider the norms of that culture when diagnosing people, especially from a different culture. And that the other aspect here is that there are cultural specific syndromes, meaning that not just what is normal in one culture, but that there may be some things that are abnormal that are specific to certain cultures. And so in the DSM, there have been listed culture specific syndromes that are considered disorders in one area, but they're not necessarily found in other places. Okay, so those are the different models: the biological, psychodynamic, behaviorism, cognitive, biopsychosocial, and sociocultural models, all explaining abnormal behavior. So the biopsychosocial model integrates all of these perspectives and proposes that abnormal behavior is a result of biological, psychological, social, and cultural influences, as we said. So how do we diagnose and classify these disorders? Well, there are some major categories that we start off with, and then we break those major categories into specific disorders. All of these can be found in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The most recent one is the 5th edition, also known as the DSM-5. And the DSM-5 provides symptoms, projected path to treatment, and the expected outcomes for how well you can expect it to recover, and the criteria for 250 disorders. It's used as a reference guide for mental health professionals and insurance companies. The first edition was published in 1952, and the DSM-5 edition was released in 2013. Examples of diagnostic categories include depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, then there are schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders, and there are neurodevelopmental disorders. We're going to visit some of these briefly, but we won't go into too much depth because you would need a whole class to learn or a whole course to learn all the specifics. How common are psychological disorders? About 1 in 4 of all American adults over the age of 18 suffer from a mental disorder in any given year. That's 61.5 million people who have a mental disorder. This is 26% of all Americans. And I would argue that probably everybody has something that they struggle with. Not just a quarter, but those are a quarter of people who are diagnosed with something that is clearly identifiable in the DSM, but that requires people being open and transparent. I actually believe everybody, if you meet them and get to really know them, everybody has a disorder. I've never met somebody who doesn't. So let's talk about the pros and cons of using labels. Well, labels help establish distinct diagnostic categories. They can help patients get effective treatment because if you know what the diagnosis is, then it's easy to identify a treatment path for that diagnosis. It also facilitates insurance coverage. It's easier to communicate with insurance companies when you're able to give a specific diagnosis. However, that it doesn't come without a cost. There are costs to diagnosis. Labels can be dangerous, or at the very least, they can cause prejudice and stigma. They can affect how others see people with labels and how they see themselves. For example, just to share a story, I remember meeting a client who everybody warned me she's bipolar. And so they all treated her like this, and it was kind of condescending, and they were very prejudiced when they met her. I tried to put it aside when I met her and just try to listen to her, and I discovered that she really was a victim of trauma, and she was really just doing the best she could, considering how she didn't know how to cope with all these feelings that she was experiencing. And so I saw her as a person, not so much as a label. And unfortunately, sometimes when we use the labels, it short circuits us getting to know people. We see them as a label rather than seeing them as a person. The same thing applies with a lot of things like schizophrenia. If you know someone's got schizophrenia, then as soon as you meet them, you see them as a schizophrenic rather than as a person. Okay, so some of the major categories include anxiety. So let's talk about anxiety disorders. Anxiety disorders can be broken up into specific groups. So the first group are phobias. Phobias are irrational, persistent fears. Some examples of phobias might include social anxiety disorder. That's a fear of being around people. It may be a fear of public speaking. That's why it's kind of related to phobias, because it's like a public speaking phobia. Basically, it's a fear of interacting with people, and it's persistent. Specific phobias include basically like fear of spiders or fear of heights and things like that. So a lot of people have. I'll talk about that in the next slide. So they include fears of animals, the natural environment. Sometimes people are afraid of thunderstorms. People have a blood injection or injury phobia. Like I can relate to that. I used to be really scared of getting my blood drawn. Even just talking about it would make me weak. One time in a biology class, they were talking about drawing blood, and I tried to raise my hand to ask a question, but I could barely lift my hand because it just felt so weak. Other people are afraid of flying in an airplane because they feel cooped up and they don't want to get off, or they want to be able to get off if they get scared. Also, if they hit turbulence, they might freak out. Some people are afraid of being in crowds. Some people are afraid of being in tight spaces, or claustrophobia, and that sort of thing. There's a long list of possible phobias that people can have. Another major phobia that's really debilitating is agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is named, it comes from the word agora, which literally means marketplace. So it means a fear of the marketplace. However, actually, agoraphobia has a broader meaning. It really means, now it means a fear of being in public or outside of someone's home. So people who have this can become trapped in their own home, and they cannot leave the house. People might think of these people as hermits, but they're not necessarily living out in the countryside. You can be stuck in your apartment or your home, be a prisoner to your own home. I've had several people who I've met who suffered from agoraphobia, and they could not leave their home. And if they did, they had to have a lot of coaxing to get out of their house. And so the only way to treat these people really is to go meet them in their own home and help them to get out slowly. There's thankfully medication for this and there's treatment options, but that's a big one that people are not oftentimes aware of. I'll talk about this more in a second. Another type of anxiety that's different from phobia. Phobia is irrational fear, but panic disorders are the sudden and recurrent onset of intense panic for no reason. So panic feels like you're having a heart attack. It's an intense, overwhelming fear, and your heart will race, and you don't know. It's just a sudden anxiety. I've had panic attacks in my life, especially when I was under a lot of stress, studying for exams, or there's a lot of stuff going on at work, and so panic attack can hit you suddenly. Now, people who have had severe panic attacks may develop agoraphobia, and that's because agoraphobia really, as we come to learn, it's not so much about a fear of being in public, it's a fear of the panic attacks that are associated with being in a certain situation. So what people do is they actually avoid those situations that could trigger the panic attack. But over time, when you avoid all the situations that can trigger panic, then the area that you can navigate in becomes smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually you cannot leave your house. So for example, if you had a panic attack and you're on an airplane, then you're not going to want to fly again because that panic attack was so powerful that you've associated with plane rides with panic attacks. So you don't want to go back there. But then if you have a panic attack somewhere else and you avoid that situation, over time, eventually you start avoiding everything. And so that's the theory about agoraphobia. It's really a fear of panic. Another category is the generalized anxiety disorder. This is different from panic disorder because panic disorder happens at specific times for no reason. But generalized anxiety disorder is a long-lasting anxiety. It's intense and unrealistic anxiety that lasts over 6 months. So we typically call this anxiety as a shorthand, but this is different. Just to be clear, generalized anxiety disorder is very different from phobias and panic disorders. Panic disorder, like I said, is usually oftentimes a specific incident. It can happen, it could last from 5 minutes to a day, but it's not typically going to last a lot more than that. Usually if someone can sleep it off. But generalized anxiety, this is just what someone's constantly going through all the time. Generalized anxiety includes feelings of dread or doom and a physical stress that lasts at least 6 months. The source of anxiety often cannot be pinpointed, whereas with phobias and panic disorders, those can be attributed to specific events because you know when it started. People with generalized anxiety, they worry about things most people would not worry about. So people would call these people worrywarts. Most people, they wouldn't freak out about every little thing, but people who have generalized anxiety, they blow up everything, and anything could be a potential stressor. There are some other related disorders that have been historically classified as anxiety, but have been since moved into other categories. So we'll talk about those next. Obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, is a recurring thought or ritualistic pattern or ritualistic behavior that creates anxiety. OCD used to be classified as an anxiety disorder, but it's no longer. And that's because people believe it creates anxiety, not that it is anxiety. So these include obsessive recurring thoughts. And so people engage in these compulsive, ritualistic, and repetitive acts to reduce their anxiety. So there's two parts to this. There's the obsession and then there's the compulsion. The obsession are the thoughts that create the anxiety. The compulsion is the act or the behavior that is induced to reduce the anxiety. So it's very much connected to anxiety, but the idea is it's separated out just so that people understand that it is a process. It may involve anxiety, but it's not the anxiety itself. So anxiety disorders, though, are considered that because they stand alone as anxiety. Then there are stress disorders. Acute stress disorder, or ASD, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, both result from exposure to a major stressor, such as a catastrophe or life-threatening event. And these can result in numerous symptoms. So, for example, if you think about a major car accident, or maybe you don't even want to think about these things because it could trigger some stress for some people. But if you were to think of or to list some stressful events, things like witnessing somebody dying or almost dying yourself, or experiencing abuse or violence, those can be very traumatic. So there's a difference between acute stress disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder, even though they're both related to life-threatening or very traumatic events. Acute stress disorder happens right after the trauma. So symptoms occur immediately after the trauma. And the symptoms include anxiety, dissociative symptoms, and nightmares. PTSD, post-traumatic stress, has similar symptoms as ASD, but it lasts longer than a month or can emerge as late as 6 months after the trauma. So it's not specifically right after the event, because acute stress disorder may go away, whereas post-traumatic stress disorder is much more enduring, and that tends to have a lot more problems. With the DSM-5, stress disorders are no longer classified as anxiety disorders. Again, like with OCD, it's not that it doesn't create anxiety, it simply stands alone. And it does create anxiety, but in contrast to anxiety disorders stand alone as anxiety. PTSD creates anxiety. I hope that makes sense. And in addition, anxiety looks forward. It's hypervigilant. It looks forward to, or it's proactive about something that could happen, whereas stress disorders are typically about something that has happened already. And so it's more about the stress that's already taken place and being overwhelmed by it. Whereas anxiety is about trying to prevent something from happening. PTSD or ASD is about something that already happened. Okay, so what causes these things? What causes anxiety and stress disorders? Well, going back to those models of anxiety, let's look at those. The biological model says that chemical imbalances in the nervous system, particularly serotonin, cause anxiety. And anxiety can also be inherited. So there's a genetic component as well as a neurotransmitter component. Then there's a psychodynamic model. And according to this model, repressed urges or desires create anxiety. So for example, if you have a fear of your own anger, or you don't like to feel guilty or shame, or you don't want to cry, you might repress those emotions and feelings. But if it creates discomfort when you feel it, then anytime those things bubble to the surface, then you might experience anxiety because you don't know how to handle those emotions. So that's the psychodynamic explanation. Then in the behavioral model, anxious behavior is learned or conditioned through past interactions with the environment. So for example, if you've learned to that, like being on a plane, there's turbulence, you might associate anytime you go on that plane with the anxiety that you've experienced in the past. So behaviorism looks at how we can condition panic and anxiety based on our experiences. Then in the cognitive model, anxiety comes from illogical, irrational thought processes. So for example, if you think that you must always be perfect, or you cannot have anybody who hates you, or you must always please everybody, then it's somebody, or another irrational thought is conflict is bad, or you should never be angry. So then whenever conflict arises, or in the inevitable course of human affairs, we have natural conflict with people. Then you might experience discomfort because you don't know how to handle that, or because you haven't accepted that. So you might experience anxiety as a result. In the biopsychosocial model, anxiety is due to the interaction of biological, psychological, social, and cultural influences. So it looks at integration of all these. And in the socio-cultural perspective, cultural variations exist in the expression of anxiety disorders. So, we might manifest anxiety in different ways depending on our culture. Like, for example, some people might repress their emotions, they might stonewall or be quiet, or in other cultures, maybe people might be more aggressive or controlling as a way to manage their anxiety. Another major category of disorders are dissociative disorders. Dissociative disorders involve a break or dissociation in a person's identity. Dissociation, it simply means that we remove ourselves, or we depersonalize ourselves from our present reality, or we step back essentially, and we lose contact with the reality around us. And so people oftentimes do this without even knowing it. People don't realize that they're dissociating. So dissociative amnesia is a loss of memory for personal information. So that can be as a way to protect themselves from something. Maybe the mind forgot something due to they dissociated themselves by forgetting information about themselves. And we're going to talk about causes or explanations for this. Dissociative fugue occurs when a person suddenly travels away from familiar surroundings with amnesia about the trip and for personal information. So it includes amnesia, but it adds running away. So someone might just disappear from their family and turn up on the other side of the country with a totally different identity because they forgot who they were. Now, and many times people do this unconsciously because they're trying to shield themselves from some kind of psychological pain. And so, that's why they have amnesia. It's a psychological process. And the third type of dissociative disorder is the dissociative identity disorder. This is having two or more distinct personalities in one body. This is historically known as a split personality or multiple personality. The technical term for it now is dissociative identity disorder. That's because in the past, split personalities were overhyped in the media and Hollywood, and sometimes people would fake things, and so sometimes the explanations became a little overblown. But now we understand that dissociative identity disorder, and even though it's still controversial, the disorder is still controversial because people still deny that it exists. But there is a lot of evidence that people do dissociate themselves dissociate parts of their personality as a way to, or as an ongoing thing. And so we'll talk about explanations for that in a second. Let's look at a case study of a multiple personality, or someone who has what is now known as dissociative identity disorder, but we used to be called multiple personality. So this is from The Three Faces of Eve. There was a movie, Hollywood movie, and a book that was produced based on this. But this is an interview with the real person. This is an interview with Chris Sizemore, who lived up until 2016. This Chris is the real Eve in the book and the movie, known as The Three Faces of Eve, written by her psychiatrists Corbett Thigpen and Hervey Cleckley. I'll show you a video clip from Eve White, followed by Eve Black. So this says, let us hear the various personalities speak. First is Eve White, demure, retiring, quiet, and conventional in manner. Beneath her reserve, you can detect some melancholy.
Are you feeling well these days?
I feel tired.
Feel tired? You felt tired for some little time, haven't you?
Yes.
I see. Do you hope and expect that this will all soon be terminated?
Yes.
How do you feel about that?
I think Jane would be the one.
You feel that she will be the one?
Yes.
How do you feel personally about it, though?
But it's just something that's got to be.
Do you
I
feel...
want to get well, and if that's the only way to get well, that's the way I want it.
Do you feel that you will be in any part of it?
No, I don't feel that way.
Does it cause you distress?
In a way, I worry about Sarah.
You feel that she may not be taken care of?
Yes.
I see. Do you regret going, or what's your feeling about it?
No. I'm tired.
Could I speak with Eve Black now?
Sure.
Eve Black? How you feel?
I feel good.
Good. Why?
I don't know.
You
I
enjoyed-
always feel good.
Did you enjoy the trip over today?
Yeah. It was disappointing, though, wasn't it?
Was it?
Yeah, you know, I thought we just zoomed through space and then we were just creeping along like a little caterpillar. I didn't even feel like I was moving.
That's your first airplane ride? How do you like all this?
I think it's real exciting.
Do you?
Don't you?
Let's look at some explanations for why people have dissociative disorders. In the biological model, this says that there are lower than normal activity levels in the areas responsible for body awareness in people with dissociative disorders. In the psychodynamic model, this believes that dissociation helps with repression of memories and can serve as a defense mechanism. So, for example, this is probably the more popular explanation, because it says that people dissociate as a way to protect themselves from traumatic memories. So, for example, if somebody suffered from abuse as a child, or in the case of Eve, she said later that she had witnessed people get killed. For example, she witnessed a man cut in half from a lumber machine, a machine that cut lumber. And so it was very traumatic for her, and it was immediately after that she started disassociating as a way to protect herself from those traumatic memories. Then there's the behaviorism and the cognitive explanations. In the cognitive and behavioral approaches, dissociative disorders are a learned response to avoid trauma-related thoughts or experiences. So again, it's similar. In the psychodynamic model, it simply just says it helps repress and serves as a defense mechanism. In the cognitive behavioral approach, it looks at it as a learned response. So they're very similar explanations, in fact. It's just the mechanisms of how it happens is a little different. Okay, let's talk about mood disorders now. This is a very important component, very commonly diagnosed category of disorders. So mood disorders include things like depression, which we're going to talk about. Mood disorders are emotional disturbances that can range from mild to extreme. So we can have extreme sadness, mild sadness, or to extreme elation on the other hand. Major depressive disorder, which is commonly known as major depression or depression, is the sudden onset of extreme sadness and despair, typically for no obvious reason or external cause. That if there was an obvious reason, then it would be simply grief or bereavement. But depression continues on without an obvious explanation. And depression is typically more common among women than men, and there could be some biological explanations for that. However, both men and women can experience depression. That's also important to remember. Depression, unfortunately, puts people at risk for suicide. And so during the winter months, people, and any time, we need to be careful about people who are maybe at risk for suicide. Just to give you an example, there have been many people who I knew as friends or casual acquaintances who have killed themselves over the years, and I had no idea that they were suicidal. Now, as a therapist, I try to be on the lookout more, but you never know who you'll encounter that could be suicidal. They may look happy on the outside, but they're sad on the inside. How do we know if someone's at risk for suicide? Well, there's 3 things we want to look for initially. The first thing is suicidal ideation. That simply means, do they think about suicide? Well, how do you know if they are? Well, you have to ask people straight up. You might ask them, have you ever thought about suicide? Or you might ask more indirectly, have there ever been days when you just didn't want to wake up? Or you didn't want to continue on? That sort of thing. But you need to ask directly at some point. The other 2 things is that they need to have a plan. So if they have a plan, then you know they're at risk. That's a big factor. That basically means if they thought about it. And then the other thing is, do they have the means? For example, if they thought about killing themselves by jumping off the Eiffel Tower, but they are nowhere near it, well, that's not immediate risk, at least. You might want to follow up with them and talk to them more, but they're not necessarily immediate risk because it's not something that's feasible. However, if they have a gun and they're talking about killing themselves with a gun, that's a big problem. Now, another thing that would heighten their risk of suicide too is if they've had previous attempt, because people who have had previous attempts are more likely to be effective the next time around. The other things that could heighten their risk is substance use. So if people are drinking or using drugs, they're more likely to do it because their judgment is impaired. And also, things like alcohol makes people even more depressed. So they're more likely to turn suicidal. So they're even at definite risk. So if you know somebody who has, suicidal ideation plan and means, then you definitely you don't really need the high risk factors to be concerned, but the high risk factors definitely make it even more so of a risk. So if you know somebody who has a risk for suicide, call 911 and your emergency numbers, or there are suicide hotlines. I'm not sure off the top of my head. It could be 1-800-SUICIDE or something like that. But call somebody, reach out and get help. And if you are suicidal, feel free to reach out and get help, or call 911, especially if you are at immediate risk, because there is hope. People can help you get through it. Okay, this is something we should talk more about because we do have a risk for that in our society, in our world in general. So depression doesn't necessarily have to be suicidal to still be impairing. As you might recall, the movie Inside Out was actually a good depiction of childhood depression. There's a child who moved and had major difficulty adjusting to the move and was depressed. And it's actually a good illustration of depression, which we're going to talk about more in a future chapter that's specifically devoted to depression.
Andrea Jacobs, president of the French Club.
When you don't want to feel, death can seem like a dream. What is she doing? But seeing death, really seeing it, makes dreaming about it ridiculous.
Wake up, freak.
You chased a bottle of aspirin with a bottle of vodka.
I had a headache.
The best place in the world for someone like you is less than a half an hour from here.
What did you do? You look normal.
I'm sad.
Well, everyone's sad.
This is the woman's ward, also known as South Bell. This is where you'll be staying, and this is where I work.
Depression is not the only type of mood disorder. Other disorders include bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorders are severe mood swings from major depressive episodes to manic episodes, and they can even have psychotic features. There are two different types of bipolar disorders, bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Bipolar 1 swings from normal to manic with or without depression. So if you think high, it goes high. Whereas bipolar 2 includes episodes of major depression and hypomania. So if you think about it this way, it swings low. So one swings high, the other swings low. The only difference is that bipolar 1 could include depression, whereas bipolar 2 only includes episodes of depression and hypomania. So there are some possible connections between bipolar disorder and other disorders, such as ADHD and adolescent onset of bipolar disorder. So there's a potential link there between ADHD and bipolar. There are higher rates of ADHD among those with bipolar disorder, and hyperactivity can oftentimes be present in both disorders. And this could be because there's some common causes for both, such as trauma. And we're still learning about all these disorders. We certainly don't know everything, and we're still discovering connections between the disorders. There's a lot of overlap, and a lot of times they're misdiagnosed as one or the other. Okay, so let's talk about causes of mood disorders. According to the biological model, mood disorders are due to imbalances of neurotransmitters such as serotonin, norepinephrine, and the dopamine systems. They're also seen as due to brain activity, or the activity in the brain, and they're also genetically inherited. So you can see how mood, depression, and bipolar are actually transmitted from generation to generation. There's also a behavioral view of mood disorders. For depression, it's oftentimes seen as due to learned helplessness. So if people feel like they cannot, like, the dogs that were zapped and they couldn't quite figure out how to avoid it, well, that's learned helplessness. So if people feel powerless in their situations, they cannot stop, abuse, or they don't have any power over their situations, that can create depression. And then the cognitive view sees depression as due to distorted illogical thinking. So this sees people as constantly negative. They're the Debbie Downers. They're always seeing the glass is half empty. And even so distorted that sometimes their thinking is illogical as well. And so it's just very negative. So mood disorders are more likely to appear in genetically related people with higher rates of risk for closer genetic relatives. That is the concordance rate, as we talked about. And so this shows that mood disorders are highly heritable, and so there's definitely a genetic link. But that's not the only explanation either. I like to get people to watch the trailer for Beautiful Minds because I would like to get them to guess what disorder they think the person in the movie has.
John Nash was one of the most brilliant minds of his generation.
Welcome to Princeton. Who among you will be the next Einstein?
Find a truly original idea, and it's the only way I will ever distinguish myself. It's the only way I will ever matter.
He saw the world.
Where's Nash?
Out there, looking for his original idea.
In ways that no one could imagine.
This flies in the face of 150 years of theory.
Congratulations, John.
It's the achievement of a lifetime.
From producer Brian Grazer and director Ron Howard.
I'm wondering, Professor Nash, if I can ask you to dinner. You do eat, don't you? How big is the universe?
Infinite.
How do you know for sure?
I don't, I just believe it.
It's the same with love, I guess.
The extraordinary gift
What can I do for the Department of Defense?
that set him apart
You are the best natural code breaker I have ever seen.
You've done your country a great service, son.
would push his mind
Get in.
What is wrong with you?
beyond its limits.
Somebody, help me!
John, open the door. Talk to me. Tell me what happened.
It didn't happen.
This is not what I signed on for.
I'm not leaving.
Stop!
You can't reason your way out of it.
Why not? Why can't I?
I need to believe that something extraordinary is possible.
Universal Pictures, DreamWorks Pictures, and Imagine Entertainment present
You have to help me.
one man's journey to the greatest discovery of all.
You don't know it's real. This is real.
Academy Award winner Russell Crowe, Academy Award nominee Ed Harris, and Jennifer Connelly.
Perhaps it is good to have a beautiful mind, but an even greater gift is to discover a beautiful heart.
A Beautiful Mind.
Not to blow the plot, but this person is suffering from schizophrenia. What is schizophrenia? The term schizophrenia is actually a misnomer. So it literally means splitting of the mind. It's not to, but while it means that, it's not to be confused with a split personality. It sounds the same. Because the split personality is a dissociative identity disorder, as we talked about. That's a completely unrelated disorder. So you have to kind of mind the misnaming here. Schizophrenia is a severe psychotic disorder. And psychotic simply means a disconnection from reality, in which the person experiences disturbances in thinking, emotions, behavior, and perception. So this is not this. When we talk about disconnection from reality, we're not talking about disassociation necessarily. They may still be connected. They may still be present, but they're not seeing reality the same way we do, at least. So their reality becomes distorted, at least, and is distorted through their thoughts and their perceptions. So many people with schizophrenia experience delusions and hallucinations. So this schizophrenia can be divided into two sets of symptoms. There's positive symptoms and negative symptoms. Positive symptoms refer to excess or distortions of normal functions. And these are associated with increases in dopamine activity. And the symptoms include delusions and hallucinations. Delusions are basically irrational beliefs, whereas hallucinations are auditory or visual illusions. Basically, you're hearing voices or seeing things. Negative symptoms, on the other hand, reflect a decrease of normal functions associated with decreased dopamine activity. And so this results in things like poor attention, flat affect, that basically means no emotion, and poor speech.
I'm not asking for sympathy. Scratch that. What's your name?
Nathaniel Anthony Ayers Jr.
You only got 2 strings.
I've had a few setbacks.
Me too. Hi, this is Steve Lopez from the LA Times. I'm calling to see if Nathaniel Ayers attended your school.
He was the most gifted kid I've ever met.
I'm gonna write a column about Nathaniel.
When people heard that you were just playing with 2 strings, some of them thought you might want something better to work with. I can't cover that.
It's a gift. What does he have? Schizophrenia?
Oh, you flying that plane? No, I'm right here.
I'm not always so sure what's going on.
He has no idea what he's saying. What's with Neil Diamond?
I thought that was you.
Your friend is downstairs.
I don't want to take full responsibility.
Oh, by all means, avoid full responsibility.
He's sick and he needs a psychiatric hospital.
You don't keep me away.
Nathaniel has one thing going for him.
Till you use me up.
A friend. Come on, you can do it. A year ago, I met a man who was down on his luck. Man, he's got a gift. I thought I might be able to help him.
Are you out of your mind?
Witnessing his courage, his humility. Do you think I could be good again? And the power of his art.
Now, I've never loved anything the way that he loves music.
Being his friend will carry you home. I'm the closest thing to family he has. We take care of each other. And we look after each other. I'm his friend.
I like to show the trailer for Soloist because it illustrates the how many people who are homeless are suffering from mental illnesses like schizophrenia. A lot of times they cannot take care of themselves. It used to be one of the downsides about moving away from asylums, or what we call deinstitutionalization, is that many of the people who are formerly housed in these institutions now end up on the streets, and we don't try to force people into institutions because the belief is that a lot of in the past they were oppressive and removed people's freedoms, and at least deinstitutionalization restored people's sense of freedom and their ability to choose for themselves. On the other hand, people who have severe schizophrenia still need to be cared for, and so there are sometimes legal processes that can be used to help ensure that people get treatment and care. But unfortunately, a lot of times people end up on the streets. And that's seen in the movie Soloist, for example. In fact, when the main character tried to get him to go to a hospital, he got really angry and upset at him. He felt like he was betrayed by his friend. Okay, so what causes schizophrenia? Well, symptoms appear to be related to high or low levels of dopamine. Unfortunately, there's no known cure yet. While we might have some ideas of what's related to it, no one's been able to figure out how to stop it. Treatment involves medication to control symptoms. However, those medications they're not necessarily cures. They help manage symptoms, and that's basically it. They're symptom management. But unfortunately, sometimes those medications can create their own problems as well. So the medications are getting better. It used to be that you would have major side effects from these medications, and they were problems in of themselves. But the newer medications have less side effects, which is good. They're getting better. But still, they're not a cure. Unfortunately, this disorder does tend to run in families. The risk of developing schizophrenia increases drastically as genetic relatedness increases. The highest risk is faced by an identical twin whose twin sibling has schizophrenia, since the concordance rate is 40 to 50%. Now, that's not 100%, so it doesn't necessarily mean that just because your twin has schizophrenia that you will get it. It just means that you have a greater chance of getting it. Now, the other thing is that some people may carry the genetic risk, which is then only expressed after an environmental trigger. So that basically says that you might have the genes for it. You might even have a twin and you might have the risk for it, but it's not necessarily going to be expressed unless you experience a lot of stress or an environmental trigger that will bring it out. So that may explain why it's not, the concordance rate is not as high as it could be. Let's talk about the role of traumatic stress in a lot of this stuff. So a lot of the disorders that we've seen can be related to psychological trauma. Psychological trauma is the damage done to the mind after an extremely stressful event that overwhelms a person's capacity to cope, such as a life-threatening event, or abuse, like if you're a victim of child abuse or domestic violence, that can bring on psychological trauma. Or if you witnessed someone dying, or you almost died yourself, you went to the hospital, or something like that, you could experience major psychological trauma, and these can be very debilitating. So, though it's often debated, trauma seems to link these various disorders, and they may even cause all these disorders to overlap and be misdiagnosed. So for example, if you look at this diagram, it shows you all the different disorders that have been linked to untreated trauma. Obviously, PTSD is related to trauma, but all the other ones could also be linked to untreated trauma, like anxiety, depression, bipolar has been linked to untreated trauma. Psychosis is not necessarily a label, but it's a feature of other disorders. But psychosis is like the schizophrenia, where people experience delusions or hallucinations, and that could be due to untreated trauma over time. The brain starts to become dysregulated. Then dissociation is also thought to be related to untreated trauma, because people might have disassociated as a way to protect themselves from the pain of the trauma, and the brain learns to continue that dissociation. Attention deficits have been thought to be related to past trauma, due to the brain going to a hyperactive mode, or as a way to be hypervigilant. Impulsivity, like addictive behavior, or acting out impulsively without really thinking, that can also be related to untreated trauma. And things like compulsions and addiction, OCD, have been linked to untreated trauma. Now, all of these, here's the thing though, many people who have these things might also say, well, I've never experienced trauma. I have PTSD. Well, PTSD, that one's obviously linked to trauma, but the other ones, you might experience similar symptoms, but you might say, well, I've never experienced trauma, so how can I experience all these other symptoms? Well, it's also, here's the thing, it's also possible that these disorders can be transmitted genetically. And unfortunately, genes don't go by the same labels we do. So there could be some underlying components that we don't understand that are getting transmitted genetically. And that makes studying these connections complex. As we learn about these disorders and we learn more about the brain, because the brain is organic, it's not, we can't divide up the brain into diagnostic categories. As we learn more about the brain, we may discover that these labels need to be revised more in the future. So children, here's another example of the link to trauma. So children who experience severe trauma, or severe trauma as a child, are 3 times more likely to develop schizophrenia later. Now, that's not to say schizophrenia is only caused by trauma, but it definitely puts you at a greater risk. So if you have a genetic susceptibility to it, then trauma can make you more likely to bring it on. Also, as I said, disassociation is thought to be a psychological defense against trauma. So people dissociate as a way to protect themselves against the pain that comes from the trauma. Now, interestingly, people have speculated that anxiety and depression may exist on a related continuum or related spectrum. Of course, they are listed as different diagnostic categories, but they may have some connections because people oftentimes have both. and they have similar feelings, symptoms, but obviously they're different. But how are they connected? Well, you might think of it this way: anxiety tends to look forward. It's forward-looking to the potential for stress or the potential for shame and pain, whereas depression looks backward. So anxiety could be a learned response to previous episodes. So people are trying to protect themselves from more pain by looking out for future events that could bring on pain. So or trauma and shame. So they go into hyperactive mode or hypervigilance, I guess you could say, to protect themselves. Depression, on the other hand, tends to be a result of pain, psychological pain, or shame and trauma. And so it's looking backward more so as a result of something. It's not necessarily trying to prevent something, it's in a response to something. So that's why learned helplessness is one of the explanations, because you've experienced this feeling of learned helplessness that you can't do anything about. And so then people experience depression. But the symptoms feel the same sometimes, and then it's oftentimes people can have both, and some people believe that anxiety can also turn into depression over time. So you might start off with anxiety, but as it progresses, or you feel like you can't do anything about your situation, then it can turn into depression. But there's some debate about that, but that's what some of the literature says. Now, trauma, the stress or this traumatic stress can be transmitted from one person to the next or intergenerationally through families. For example, if you did a genogram of your family, you might discover that there are some things that get passed down from generation to generation. So, for example, this is a genogram of one family I know. This is, if you take a look at this, the squares represent the men and the circles represent the women. And so in the middle row, we see the father and the mother. And at the bottom, we see their children, the daughter and son. At the top, you can see, if you trace this, you can see that there is some depression in all the women in the family. And then there are some addictions as well. But as you can see, the women on the right side all experience both anxiety and depression. As I said before, anxiety and depression seem to oftentimes go together. Interestingly, they also experience diabetes. And so there may be, we do know that some of these disorders can cause difficulties in weight management, and there could be biological explanations for that as well, with the neurotransmitters and stuff like that. Because they also had weight challenges controlling their weight, and so there may be a connection there. But if we look at it this way, we can see how disorders really get passed down genetically and they're inherited. But that also says that you may not have experienced some trauma or stress in your life, but you may be inheriting the results of something that your parents or their parents developed. So that brings us to the subject of historical trauma. Historical trauma is an emerging theory that's been just developed since around 2015 to the latest publication that I know of was in 2018. Historical trauma is this idea that trauma or traumatic stress is passed down from generation to generation and can even become part of a culture or a group of people. For example, people who have ancestors who were slaves or who survived the Holocaust may inherit the trauma that their ancestors went through. And that could explain why certain groups of people suffer from certain challenges, whereas other groups do not. So that's one theory. Researchers found that the sons of Union Army soldiers who were prisoners of war during the U.S. Civil War were more likely to die young than the sons of soldiers who were not prisoners. So we're looking at, this is a study of thousands of soldiers, the medical records of thousands of soldiers during the U.S. Civil War. And so they're finding that, they found that if they were POW, their sons had shorter lives. Now, it's interesting to note that the sons were born after the war, so the sons did not experience the trauma personally. So how do we explain this? The theory is then that the stress of the war was passed down to the next generation. They inherited it somehow. Now, there's several possible theories for this. It could be genetic, it could be epigenetic, which epigenetic simply means those things that modify the how the DNA is expressed without actually changing the DNA code itself. So that's epigenetics. But it could also simply be through family learning. So we learn from our environment traumatic responses. So for example, if your parents were anxious, you might learn to be anxious because that's the way they were. Or if they were depressed, you may learn it that way too. Or they might be abusive. As we know, hurt people hurt people. So they may just pass it on. And for example, if they suffered from mental illness like PTSD or depression, they may be more susceptible to abuse their children. I'm not to say that all people who have those are abusers, but they may be more likely to hurt other people because they've been hurt. As they say, hurt people hurt people. So it's possible that this could be through either pathways, through nature or nurture. But either way, the trauma gets passed down from generation to generation. And that's why it's called historical trauma. So in closing, it's important to understand the different diagnoses because we might have some disorders, first of all, and we may want to know how we can get help we need or what could have caused it. And it's also helpful because it helps us to empathize with other people who may also be suffering. Rather than assuming that people are crazy, it might be good to know that they're suffering from a mental illness and that those mental illnesses could be caused by biological causes or past experiences. So let's talk about some potential spiritual implications as well. I met a woman once who was an addict and an alcoholic. She was in rehab and she had major addictions. She had been addicted to all kinds of drugs and she was a major alcoholic. And I discovered, though, in talking to her, well, first of all, it's very easy for people to judge a person like that. We know from research, though, that a lot of women who are alcoholics have been previously abused. And so I discovered when I talked to her that she had survived some majorly severe trauma. She was a victim of multiple rapes as a child. And unfortunately, it caused a lot of pain in her life. And so she knew, as I've talked about in previous situations, she knew the one thing that could help her, and that was alcohol. So, and unfortunately, she had this caused other problems in her life. But the alcohol helped serve to numb the pain that came from the trauma. In addition, it was like an avoidance strategy as well. In addition, people who suffer from alcoholism are oftentimes really depressed. Alcohol can cause depression, but it can also be a way to manage depression that was already there. So it could be both too. I think of how Jesus met a woman who was caught in adultery. Rather than judging her, everybody wanted him to judge her. In fact, one expected him to pronounce that she should be stoned because she was caught in adultery, and that was the law. But rather than judging her, the Bible says that Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. So when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Well, everybody started to clear out because they started to realize that no, they're not without sin. So the text says that Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she says. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." Now, I'm not saying mental health is a sin issue. What I am saying, though, is that all of us struggle with things. And rather than judging people, it's important to accept and understand where people are coming from. Jesus looked at this woman and understood her context. He knew that, she might have been a victim of abuse. And so rather than judging her, he accepted her. And, none of us are perfect. We all have struggles in our lives. So it's important to understand, how we can be accepting of ourselves. All of us are broken. We are all perfectly abnormal. Isaiah 53 says, "We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our way." Like I said, we all have struggles. And so rather than looking at people as abnormal, we all have our different challenges. So I like to think that we're all perfectly abnormal. And Jesus saw the good in people. He didn't look at people as labels. He saw their beauty despite their brokenness. And that's my hope for all of us. Rather than seeing people as a label, like they're suffering, they're schizophrenic or they're addicts, I like to see that they are people who just so happen to have challenges. That's because God sees the beauty in each of us. God empathizes with us and understands the challenges that we've gone through, which is why he died for us in our sins. He didn't die with the hope that we would change. He died for us knowing who we are. And so I like to remember that John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life." And that's good news. So whatever challenges we have, there's hope that we can be restored and we can be set free from those challenges. Now, we may not receive freedom in this lifetime, especially if we've had biological problems that have no cure. But there is hope. There is hope that maybe through time we can be healed, or maybe we will be healed when we get to heaven. But either way, there is hope for all of us. And I also like to cling to this promise. For those of us who have struggles that we want to get rid of, we can be assured that God promises to help us. Philippians 1:6 says, "Being confident," this is what Paul writes, "being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will continue to perfect it until the day of Christ Jesus." So until Christ comes back, that process will continue, where we continue to heal and recover from our challenges. And if not in this lifetime, we will be perfected when Jesus comes again. We will become perfect. We will have freedom. So there's good news. We don't have to feel like we're going to be stuck forever in the challenges that we have. So I hope you can join us for our next chapter, where we continue to talk about abnormal behavior, specifically 4 other types of struggles. We're going to look at eating disorders, sexual disorders, substance abuse, and other things as well. So I hope you can join us. Thank you for listening.